I wanted to provide a little bit of a overview of some of this week's content. This week we cover a lot of important skills that are going to be crucial for you to become a successful writer of research papers. As you can see here, um, this is my habits of critical reading document. So, I want you to read all of these handouts, of course. But at the same time, I thought it would be useful to impress a few extra things on you guys. So here's my habits of critical reading handout, and this thing pretty much tells you it's important for you to read if there's an article you want to use in your research writing. Well, first of all, you need to do your due diligence, resorting back to the fundamentals of rhetoric. Who wrote this thing? Who is its intended audience? What's the purpose of this text? And then you can kind of determine whether or not it's even appropriate to be used in the research writing situation you have found yourself in when your instructor gave you a paper to write. So, one of the first things that you'll do is sort of preview the text, and it's my preference that any article or text you ever are going to use in your research writing, you should print that thing out and get a pen, and you need to write all over it. Make notes. This is the first. Well, the first real step is to read something carefully, and the way you do that is to take notes as you read. So will ask you this semester to reverse outline a couple of documents. We'll do that in particular in the humanities unit. But to reverse outline, the idea is, well, if you were to write a paper, you would come up with some ideas and you would put up kind of an outline that says, well, here's what my intro is going to give in the thesis, and the body of the paper, these are my supporting ideas, and I'll give each of these supporting ideas their own paragraph. Well, when we reverse outline, we take an article or a piece of writing and we kind of reverse engineer that article. And the way we do that is with each single paragraph, you read the paragraph and you ponder over it just a second and you figure out what's that one piece of information that I need to take with me as I move through this article. And you write that piece of information next to the paragraph on that sheet of paper. And so with each paragraph, I should see a half sentence or a whole sentence that says what you learned from that paragraph. So the reverse outline is very useful for basically teaching yourself what you've read as you move through it. And the task of having to do this thing, to decide what information is the piece of information I need moving forward, that's making you engage more deeply with the text as you read. And in effect, what you're doing is you're teaching yourself the content of that article as you move through it. But I have a lot of other things that I do when I read an article, as you'll see in the rest of the document. But the reverse outline to me is one of the most important one. And sometimes you'll hear instructors say you need to make annotations. It's just a fancy word for make notes as you read. Well, your annotations, your margin notes, can be very useful. Let's just say if you're asked to summarize an entire article, you'll look at your little notes that you've written, and it'll sort of be your guide for how to summarize this thing. Other things that I do, you'll see in these other little areas, like putting question marks, logging questions, or putting a star by something where I understand what I've read or if it seems important. Or and then occasionally I may even underline something. What I find with my little system here is the things that I've underlined, that's the content oftentimes I find myself quoting directly. The places I put the asterisks, those tend to be next to paragraphs that I want to paraphrase. And then my margin notes are very useful for summarizing that text. Moving on. So this is how this is going to sound. In the case of this assignment, I've asked that students read this article by Nicholas Carr, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And it was a very popular article when it came out in 2008. Still very relevant so many years later. The article starts in a somewhat creative way. He's using a movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, as kind of a metaphor for what the entire sort of essay has to say about maybe how our computer habits are rewiring the way we think. So this is maybe what you might write in the margins of this article here that you printed. After you read this first paragraph, you might write film example that shows how a computer becomes smarter than a human. Okay? And maybe you read this next paragraph. And then maybe to summarize this one, you might write in the margin something to the effect of, writer says his attention span is lessening and that he can't concentrate on long articles. You might find that you feel that way too as you read this 7 or 8 page article here. So what you want to do is you want to be careful to be very specific as you move through it, or else you might end up writing the same thing every paragraph. Well, what you're trying to do is find that next new piece of information, and sometimes you have to dig a little bit, okay? So that's one of the things that I wanted you to do for homework. Reverse outline this article and make notes as you read. This is a really handy scan from an old textbook we used to use. It's called, I think on the middle page, Using Sources and Avoiding Source Abuse. It's something like that. I like how this page clarifies why you even use sources to begin with, and they cover those here. They say, of course, deepen, develop your point, support your ideas, your point in your thinking, and even here, sometimes you incorporate a source because you want to address it and then argue against it. It's interesting to me that they follow up the right reasons to use a source immediately with a bit of a warning here. Use restraint with direct quotes. This tends to be in English 111 and English 112 students' default setting. When they hear an instructor say, I want you to write a research paper, that translates in their mind to, well, my instructor wants me to use direct quotes from sources that I find. But that isn't really the case. You want to be careful about the places you choose to use quotations. So read this thing and they kind of explain why. This is a page I reference a lot, particularly on students' papers, as I leave them feedback. This smooth integration page. What they've done down here is they've shown you what a body paragraph looks like and where content from the source belongs. So this is kind of a play-by-play. You got a topic sentence here. Very quickly after the topic sentence, kind of in that number 2 zone of the body paragraph method. That's where they've decided to use a direct quote. But as you can see here, whether you paraphrase, quote, or summarize, what you need to do is set up the source. In the case of this, that's called a signal phrase, by the way. In the case of this signal phrase, or attributive phrase, they've given the article's title in quotes, and they've provided all of the author's names, and then an attribution verb. These guys argue that, and here's the direct quote, and when the quote is over, they give the page number. Now, after this part 2 of the paragraph, we get into part 3, which is analysis or explanation. This chunk here is all meant to explain the quote and help make sense of it. And then finally, the last sentence is a tie-in that sort of ties in with the paper's thesis. As you scroll through this particular document, you're going to see a lot of other helpful advice. In particular, I like this part here that offers a lot of verbs that should be helpful, giving attribution to your sources. Our sort of default go-to attribution verb is always person, says, or states, but these are much more purposeful and can already help your reader sort of know what to do with the information before they begin to read those quotes or those paraphrase content. Scrolling through, again, I do want you to read all of this. There's some content about plagiarism. These source abuses tend to be less talked about than sort of blatant plagiarism situations. These are going to be probably more common and more likely in most of my students because we're still learning the ropes. What's the best way to incorporate sources? So I'd like you to pay special attention to this page as well. Particularly using source material and plunking quotations. This might be these authors' particular term for this, but if you look at the model, when you plunk a quotation, it's when you write a complete sentence and then you follow your sentence up with just a directly quoted sentence. You don't provide any signal phrase, you don't introduce your source, and maybe those two sentences don't even kind of connect with each other in any kind of way that makes sense or that is evident to the reader. It just becomes a kind of a confusing reading situation for your reader. So that's one to work on avoiding, but these other ones are just as important. People tend to use sources inaccurately when they don't read their sources fully and reverse outline, and they don't use them carefully, or they take them out of context here, or they just choose a part of a text to make it sound like they're saying your source is saying something that they're actually not. This is a little handout. It gives you kind of a step-by-step process for how to really properly summarize, paraphrase, and directly quote. And first of all, I would want you to know that when you summarize, essentially what you're doing is you're condensing or compressing text. And so when you compress text, oftentimes some of the content just has to be lost. And what remains is that essential idea that you could put in a briefer form. You tend to keep the main idea or perhaps a supporting idea, but it doesn't sort of retain a lot of the helpful analysis and explanation that the original gave, perhaps. But the idea here is that it's all about compression. When we paraphrase, oftentimes people will say, well, when you paraphrase, you put things in your own words. But the truth is, when you summarize, you put things in your own words as well. So to me, the real distinction is when you paraphrase, more than likely what you're trying to do is preserve. You're trying to take the idea and perhaps retain some of the analysis that the original had. So that distinction, telling the difference between summary and paraphrasing, probably won't matter when you're trying to integrate sources. But when I give feedback back to you later this semester, I might point to a long quote and say, it would have been better if you'd paraphrased this particular idea, because just copy pasting a chunk of that article isn't as helpful as having you put it in your own words and explain it in a more accessible way via paraphrasing. So take a look at these. The one thing I'll draw your attention to is the bold number 5 on the summary handout and the bold number 4 on the paraphrase. In these, I suggest that you create a kind of key from the source that you're looking at, a short bulleted list that collects a few points that you want to bring into the paper that you're writing. This way, you'll begin to be able to push that source away and put things in your own words.